at your message outline for today. We are starting a new series, and we're going to look at the character of God. And we're going to go about 10 or 12 weeks or so. But that being said, we are just going to kind of skim the surface of who God is. This is quite a challenging endeavor. But today I'd like to talk about the eternal God. The eternity of God from everlasting to everlasting. Psalm 90 says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, where you brought forth the earth and the world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Now it's striking to me when you think about the book of Psalms. I know you normally think about David, but this particular psalm is written by Moses. And when he writes this in Psalm 90, verse 2, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And verse 1, you have been our dwelling place through all generations. There's some history behind those words, which we're going to look at today in Exodus chapter 3. This is how Moses became introduced to God. Now, introductions are always kind of a funny thing for me. When I was a little boy, having my name, Seth, and Gatchel, I don't know how many times that I would introduce myself to somebody. They say, what's your name? And I say, Seth. And the next thing was, what? Seth. What? Seth. And they finally get Seth, and they say, well, what's your last name? And that wasn't all that helpful either. Gatchel. They go, what? Gatchel. And it kind of took a while for them to finally get my name, and then I got called, especially by boys, almost anything except my real name. As I got older, I have an amazing ability to forget people's names very quickly. Anybody else relate to this? You meet somebody, and within 5 seconds, you heard their name, but in 5 seconds, you could not recall their name if your life depended on it. And even after all these years trying to remember people's names is tough. When I was coaching boys baseball and girls soccer years ago, you have a team for about 4 months. Remember this, and you've got your 12 kids on your roster. But it's not just those 12 kids you're trying to learn. You're trying to learn 12 mothers' names and 12 fathers' names and the little brothers and little sisters that show up for practice. And you probably have about 50 names that you are trying to learn in a 4-month window of time, and then they are gone. And very early in the process, I realized that was kind of a hopeless endeavor, so I decided I was just going to try to give everybody a nickname. And that seemed to help quite a bit. And a few months ago, we had a lady that came, I had not seen in maybe 15 years or so, one of my old soccer moms from years ago. And I recognized her, and I was trying to remember her daughter's name, and I couldn't remember her daughter's name. But I did remember the nickname that I gave her. Thunder was her nickname. She was one of the taller girls on the team, just one of those powerful kids, you could get the ball and you could move down. And I had her teamed up as forward with another girl, and her nickname was Lightning. It's Thunder and Lightning. They were my two forwards up front. And I remembered Thunder, and I saw the mother, and I was trying to remember her name, and I was trying to remember the girl's name, and oh, you're Thunder's mom is what ended up coming out of my mouth. Well, something of that is going on here in our story today with Moses and God, as God introduces himself, so to speak, to Moses. The eternal God is what we're going to look at first. In Genesis 21:33, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called upon the name of the Lord, the eternal God. Now, why did he plant a tree? He planted a tree because he was a shepherd, and there was another fellow there, Abimelech, that had more shepherds than he did, and also had an army. And they were sort of this question about who had the well rights over here. And Abraham thought that this might be the end of him. And somehow God gave favor to him and to Abimelech, kind of one of those dodge the bullet kind of things. And he realized that God had spared him, he and his family, of being killed. And he planted a tree. But when he planted the tree, it said he called upon the name of the Lord, the eternal God. There was something he understood in that episode of life, that challenge of life, that related to the eternal nature of God that helped him. In Deuteronomy 33, Moses, near the end of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, he's giving instructions to the people to go into the land, the promised land, and take the land. And he says, the eternal God is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. He will drive out your enemy before you, saying, destroy him. You're going to go into a situation that you're going to feel overwhelming. You don't know how you're going to win all these battles with all these different tribes, these strong peoples. But he says your trust is not just in God, but in the eternal God. Why would that be important in coming against the different situations the challenges you're going to face? Psalm 119, all your words are true. All your righteous laws are eternal, the psalmist says. Not just laws for today or tomorrow, but eternal. Isaiah 26, trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord is the rock eternal. We know we're supposed to trust God, we get that. But his trust is in the character and nature of God, who is eternal. Jeremiah 10 says, the Lord is the true God, the living God, the eternal God. There's something about the nature of God when Jeremiah is going through just disappointment after disappointment after disappointment in his ministry and the people that he is clinging to the God who is eternal. On the inside of your handout, Paul says in Romans 1:20, ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature and his eternal power and deity have been clearly perceived in things that have been made, so people are without excuse. So as you look at the world around you, and if you are open-minded to what you see in the physical world, Paul says you should be able to see a couple of things and know something about the nature of God. And one of them is his eternal nature. Paul says in Ephesians 3:11, according to the eternal purpose which he accomplished in Christ Jesus our Lord. And what Paul means here is that when you read the Old Testament, you think, well, there was the chosen people, but what about everybody else? And it's easy to sort of read it as if that's the case. But ever since the very beginning, the plan was to use the chosen people to reach all the nations, all the peoples, all the ethnic groups of the world. And what Paul says in Ephesians 3 is, he did it. He did that very thing. The eternal purpose long before even we were made. And then 1 Timothy 1:17. Paul gives a little benediction. Now unto the King eternal, immortal, invisible, the only wise God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. Now, I want to spend the rest of our morning here in Exodus chapter 3. It's what's called the burning bush episode. It's we sort of pick up the beginning of Moses and the story of the people being delivered out of 400 years of slavery in Egypt. And the story of Moses is really an intriguing story. There's some friends of mine who came to the Lord late in life. Now, one of the things that they have dealt with is to sort of lament the fact that, God, I wish I'd come to the Lord sooner in life, and God could use my life more, and it seems like I wasted so much of my adult years. But you should be able to relate to Moses. From age 0 to 40, roughly, he was a Hebrew who was rescued out of the Nile River. He was supposed to be thrown into the Nile River, according to Pharaoh, but was rescued by one of the young women in the palace of Pharaoh, taken and raised in the palace up until about age 40. But he and they were surreptitiously, she was surreptitiously feeding him as his wet nurse. And he grows up and he knows his heritage is with the Hebrew people. And one day at age 40, he's out amongst his people, and one of the Egyptian taskmasters is treating one of the Hebrew people really, really poorly. And it just infuriates Moses. And he goes over and he kills the Egyptian and hides him in the sand. And the next day he goes out about his business, and there are 2 Hebrew men who are arguing, and he tries to help these men not to argue. And they say, aren't you the same guy that killed the Egyptian yesterday? And at this point, Moses realized what he did was not a secret. It would get out there. And he fled from Egypt out east towards Israel and lived the next 40 years of his life as a herder, a shepherd, out in the desert. Grew up 40 years in the palace, thought he could make a difference with his own people, and now he realizes that he screwed all that up, and there he is 40 years out in the desert, just sort of watching his father-in-law's sheep out in the hot sun. His life just sort of just disintegrating away slowly. And we come to this point in his life at age 80 in chapter 3 of Exodus. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Now, if you're not familiar with this story, there is a bush that's over here, and it is on fire. And you can imagine, if a bush in the desert gets on fire, it's not going to last very long. But this fire just continues to come from this bush. And he's curious about this. Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. Now try to imagine yourself in this situation. You've been out in the desert for 40 years. You see this strange bush on fire, but the fire's not going out. And then suddenly there's a voice from the burning bush and calling your name. Moses, Moses. Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Now, this is the beginning of God introducing himself, as we might think of it, to Moses. Normally, we would give our name and something of what we've done. And God is sort of doing that. He's not given his name yet, but he is describing who he is. He's being descriptive. And his first thing is to tell him, you are standing on holy ground. Now, what's the inference here? The inference is that there's something different about me, Moses, than you. Holy means to be separated apart for a different purpose, or something that is other than this. And it stops him in his tracks. Verse 6, you are standing on holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Now, when you and I give introductions, we say, hi, I'm Ken, or I'm Kathy, or I'm Mike. Hi, I'm Seth. But when God gives his name at the first, this is what he says, I am the God of your father. And then he goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the God of Joseph. And then at least a 400-year period of time while the Hebrews were in slavery, and then coming out of that slavery, or just about ready to come out of slavery, and God meets him here. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. What would strike you about that? This is not just some emanation or just some spirit, but somebody who's been around and given promises to the patriarchs, to his ancestors for maybe 600 years or so. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. He understands who he's standing in front of. Why does he hide his face? For the last 40 years, he's been a fugitive on the run from the law, we might say. A wanted poster back in Egypt for murder. And maybe by this time he thought that he had finally eluded the law and he would live in peace and safety here. But even if everybody else had died and forgot about Moses and the murder, he suddenly realized there's somebody who hasn't forgotten. I think that's what he's scared of. There's a skeleton in his closet that's a large skeleton. He's been able to bypass this so far, but now is God going to bring the skeleton back in front of him? Verse 7, the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. God doesn't mention the murder at all. There's something else that concerns him, concerns God. And he wants to communicate this to Moses. There's something heavy on his heart. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. Now, the first few verses about God's holiness and the eternity and back generations, hundreds of years. Some of these qualities theologians call the transcendence of God, that he is very different above us. He's something very other than us, and omnipotent and omnipresent and omniscient and those kind of things, holy. But here, what he's describing, how God is describing himself, is that he's very, what theologians call the immanence of God. That he cares, that he sees what's going on, and it bothers him. He weeps over this. He hears the people crying out. Verse 8, I have come to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? What he's saying is, if you got, some big king to go and make an appeal, maybe Pharaoh would listen to a king. But I'm a nobody. Plus, I have a history. And you think Pharaoh's going to listen to me? Verse 12, God said, I will be with you. That's his answer to Moses' fear. I will be with you. And this will be a sign to you. And if I'd been Moses at that moment, he says, and this will be a sign to you, I'm expecting something miraculous is going to happen in front of me. But that's not the kind of sign God gives to him. Here's the sign. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. You mean when it's all said and done, then I'll see the sign? God says, yeah. That's not exactly what I was hoping for. Verse 13, Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. That's how God has introduced him so far, which I think of as name number one, the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Say, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they asked me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? It's almost like, well, I've heard this, but you go by pastor, but what's your real name? Sort of like that. You go by doctor, but what's your real name? Verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. You think, what? It's kind of like Seth. What? Gatchel. What? I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. What in the world was he telling Moses? He was telling him something very important about himself. And as we read this passage, this is sort of the pinnacle of what he means, but the rest of the verses, both before and after, sort of fill in these four details about what God is telling Moses about himself. First of all, God is saying, I am self-existent. From everlasting to everlasting. There's no beginning with me, and there's no end with me. Secondly, that he's eternal. And in that sense of being eternal, he's unchangeable. The third thing he's telling him is that there's something about the nature of God that's incomprehensible. There's some things we can know about God, and we're going to study those over the next 10, 11, 12 weeks. But there are some aspects of this that if we study even all of our life about the character of God, we're still going to come up short of knowing everything about him. And the fourth thing is that he is faithful to his promises. He is true. And several times in this passage, he goes back and refers to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with the intent of reminding Moses, that the promises given to the patriarchs hundreds of years before are still alive. He's still going to bring these about. Verse 15, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. So he comes back, as I think about name one and name two, back and forth. But he's trying to say, there's reason for me, there's reason for my name. The people should respond to that. Verse 16, go assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt. He reminds him, tell him who I am. And tell him that I know what's going on with you. And I'm here to do something. It's time to do something about this. If you read the story in the next few chapters, you find Moses really struggling with this. God, I don't know if I'm up to this. Pharaoh's not going to listen to me. I don't care what name I tell him about you. He is powerful and he's not going to be moved. And God says, I know that, not without some miracles. And the next number of chapters in Exodus describe this power play back and forth between Pharaoh and Moses and God. I'm sort of reminded of, when I think about this, of an episode from years ago by Coach Jim Valvano, who was coached North Carolina State basketball for a number of years. And in 1983, their team ended up winning the national championship against, you remember who? Phi Slamma Jamma, University of Houston. And nobody in the world thought they were going to win. They were tremendous underdogs. They were ahead at halftime, and they ended up winning on a miracle shot right at the end of the game. And everybody just went, I couldn't believe it. Just one of those, and I think it was rated the highest NCAA college moment, basketball moment in the century.
Yeah, that shot missed. The guy got that rebound right before that.
Yeah. The guard put up a shot from about 30 feet, and it was coming down just short of the rim. And one of their forwards went up and got it just in the rim and dunked it right at the buzzer. It's an incredible thing. And so you had Jim Valvano, this Italian coach, super personality, running up and down the court, jumping on his players. Everybody's going nuts. And afterwards, he gets a phone call from the White House, President Reagan. And he picks up the phone, and the operator says, hi, this is the White House. And Jim Valvano says, so you know what I did? I hung up. He said, well, maybe you get calls from the White House all the time. Maybe that's, but me, I thought it was my cousin Vinny. He was playing a prank on me. So the phone rang again, and this time the person on the other, this is the White House, do not hang up. And he ended up talking to President Reagan. But there's something of that. You'll listen as long as you know who's on the other end of the phone and if they're important enough. That's something of what's going on here in this dialogue between God and Moses. God continues, verse 17, I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into the land, the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, the land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, and here we go again, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey in the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. And that's exactly what happens. The 10 plagues in Egypt are about to occur. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. Now, it ends up happening like God says. After the 10 plagues happen, Pharaoh finally relents. The people are let go. They're on the west bank of the Red Sea. Pharaoh has a change of heart. He sends his army. God sends a cloud to separate the army from the people. At night, the waters of the Red Sea part. 2 million people cross on dry land. When the last little boy runs up the other side on the east bank of the Red Sea, the army on the west side, Egyptian army, runs down into the seabed, and the waters close in, and the people on the west bank, the east bank of the Red Sea, watch this miracle occur of deliverance. And it's not too long when Moses and the people are standing at the Mount Horeb, where God said, this will be the sign to you. When you are standing here, then you will know that I have done it. And later on, Moses writes the verses we looked at the very beginning of the message in Psalm 90. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. What does that have to do with my life? What does that have to do with your life? I think for Moses, this was an anchor in the midst of all kinds of just chaos in his life and among the people. There's a couple, I want to just finish with this story this morning, named Larry and Vanita, and this is certainly an unfortunate last name, Schlopfelt. Schlopfelt. You know, I thought Gatchel was bad explaining. Schlopfelt. They were young marrieds, and they were Christians. They had a dream of going overseas to serve the Lord in missions. And one day they were out with some friends, and she was in the back seat of the car, and they had a head-on car crash. She was thrown out of the back seat of the car and rushed to the hospital. And the doctor came out after they'd been with her, and her spinal cord had been cracked. And he said she would never walk again. And she would be a quadriplegic. She would never be able to use her arms or hands. The doctor said, you're going to have to get her out of bed in the morning. You're going to have to dress her. You're going to have to give her breakfast. You're going to have to give her her bath. There's nothing she's going to be able to do that she used to be able to do. And he said, I don't even think you're going to be able to have children. Well, as you can imagine, they went through a time of tremendous grief and struggle and all the different stages of grief that they went through, but they came out that other side of acceptance. They still desired to go overseas to do missions, and they ended up going to Caracas, Venezuela, and opened up a bookstore there. And she was in her wheelchair all of her adult life, sharing the Lord with the people that came into the bookstore to buy their books. Just an amazing story of how God could use somebody like that with not being able to do hardly anything. It's really not that different than Moses, who felt like for 80 years he had squandered away his life, and what more can I do for God? And what God tells Moses here at age 80, and what he told Larry and Vanita when they were young marrieds, is entrust yourself to the everlasting God. The God from beginning to end. Be a part of my story. Do what you can for my story. I desire to use your life. If I can use a bush, I can use you. Let's pray together. Father, it's very easy to, when we think about you, to think about you sort of like we think about us, except extrapolate a little bit higher in all of the things that you are wiser and stronger and more knowledgeable. But we really don't see you as transcendent, as someone very different from us in some ways, as holy, as eternal, from everlasting to everlasting. And yet, in the life of Moses and in the lives of the Schlopfelts, the fact that you are not just some silver idol or gold idol on at the park, or some little statue in a shrine somewhere, but you are the living God from everlasting to everlasting. Anchored Moses and anchored the Schlopfelts and can anchor us in all of the many challenges that we go through. This is not your first rodeo with us. We come to you as Moses did there, as humble people, and say, God, we want to be used by you as a part of your plan. and take us as we are, no matter what our baggage and skeletons in the closet, no matter what our past has been. We surrender ourselves and put ourselves in your hands.